December 20th, 1944, 6:15 hours. The Belgian village of Trois Ponts slept under 20 inches of snow. The wind hissed through the pines, sweeping across a narrow steel bridge spanning the Amblève River. The air smelled of cordite and diesel. Carried from the east, from a front that was supposed to be stable, 23 American soldiers stood watch there, stamping frozen feet, joking about the cold. Their orders were simple: hold the bridge until relieved. But that relief would never come. They were clerks, engineers and military police. Not elite paratroopers, not armored infantry, just men filling a gap on the map that no one thought would matter. For most of them, the war had been distant thunder. Until that morning, Lieutenant Lyle Bouck Jr., a 20-year-old platoon leader of the 394th Infantry Regiment, looked through his binoculars at the snow-choked valley. Visibility, maybe 150 yards. Radio reception, gone. The fog had swallowed the air. Above him, somewhere, American planes sat useless on the ground, grounded by the same storm that now rolled through the Ardennes. His men were restless. Private Sam Jenkins muttered, "Hell, Lieutenant, feels like Christmas is just waiting for us to freeze to death." Bouck forced a grin. "Then we'll freeze the enemy first," he said. But even he didn't believe it. To the east, deep in the forest, engines stirred a low mechanical growl. It wasn't thunder. It was Panzer Division 12, part of Hitler's last gamble. The Ardennes Offensive, or as the Germans called it, Wacht am Rhein, watch on the Rhine. Their mission: break through the Allied lines, capture Antwerp, and divide the British and American armies. For that to happen, they needed bridges, especially this one. At dawn, German commanders believed the bridge at Trois Ponts was barely defended. Their intelligence suggested a handful of engineers and signal troops. Nothing serious. "It will be taken before breakfast," one captain reportedly said. He was only half right. The bridge would be taken, but not before 23 Americans bought 36 hours of time. That changed the entire battle. The first light crept through the fog, catching the snow in pale blue streaks. Bouck adjusted his field glasses again. He saw nothing, just white and silence. Then, faintly, movement, black shapes between trees, 30, maybe 40 meters apart. At first, he thought it was a patrol. Then came the unmistakable clatter of treads. Tanks. He lowered the glasses, his voice barely above a whisper. "Positions. This is it, boys." The men scrambled to their foxholes. The bridge was rigged with C3 explosives, detonator wires coiled near Bouck's boot. Machine guns were mounted, 230 caliber Brownings, 150 cal near the bridgehead. Ammunition boxes stacked like bricks. They had maybe 15,000 rounds total. Enough for a few hours if they fired in bursts. Not long if they didn't. Bouck checked his watch. 6:40. The engines grew louder. The frost trembled on his helmet. Then came the first silhouettes. Gray uniforms, rifles slung, unaware of the trap ahead. Private Jenkins exhaled into his scarf. "That's a lot of Christmas guests." Bouck waited until the first German squad reached the far side of the bridge, 50 yards away. Then he gave a single nod. The night exploded. The Brownings roared, their 450 rounds per minute, tearing through fog and flesh alike. The first burst shredded the lead German column. The second struck the bridge decking, sparking metal and screams. The shockwave echoed through the valley, shattering the illusion of quiet forever. The Germans scattered, falling flat, shouting for mortar. The Americans kept firing short, precise bursts to conserve ammo. Traces stitched the air red and green, reflecting off the snow like Christmas lights of hell. Bouck ducked as a grenade landed 5 feet away, rolling against a snowbank. It hissed, sputtered, a dud. He didn't flinch, only whispered, "Lucky us." Within minutes, the radio cracked and died. The only sound left was the constant rhythm of gunfire and the dull thud of artillery in the distance. For the next 3 hours, the Germans attacked in waves, 20 men at a time, then 50, then an entire company. The Americans held, bleeding, freezing, fighting for every bullet. At 10 o'clock hours, a shell landed near the command post, blowing apart the telephone line. Bouck's ears rang. Blood trickled down his cheek. "Still here," he shouted. A faint voice answered. "Still here, sir." He looked again through his binoculars. Smoke drifted across the bridge. Dozens of bodies lay sprawled, half covered in snow. Behind them, through the haze, German officers gestured furiously, trying to rally. Bouck couldn't hear them, but he could imagine the disbelief. To the Germans, this wasn't a battle, it was an inconvenience. To the 23 men of the 394th, it was the edge of the world. By noon, they had already done the impossible. They had stopped the first German advance cold. But Bouck knew the next assault would be worse. He crouched beside his men and said quietly, "They think we're a whole company. Let's make sure they keep thinking that." He looked toward the river, the fog swirling like smoke from some giant's breath. The men checked their magazines, tightened gloves, whispered prayers. In the distance, engines revved again, dozens of them this time. The storm wasn't over. It was only gathering. They came thinking we were nothing, Bouck thought, gripping his rifle. But by tomorrow, they'll know exactly who we are. To understand how 23 men found themselves standing against 800 Germans, you have to step back to the bigger madness unfolding across the Ardennes. In December 1944, the Allies had believed the war in Europe was nearly over. Paris was free. The German army was retreating. And American generals were already drawing lines on maps for a final push into the Rhineland. Winter, they thought, would bring a pause in the fighting. But Adolf Hitler had other plans. On December 16, 1944, in a surprise strike that stunned the world, Germany launched its final major offensive on the Western Front. The Battle of the Bulge began with more than 200,000 German soldiers, 1,000 tanks and assault guns, and 1,900 artillery pieces, smashing into a 250-mile Allied front. Their objective, drive through the weakly held Ardennes forest, cross the Meuse River, and seize the port of Antwerp, cutting the Allied armies in two. It was a plan of desperation and audacity, and it depended on speed. For that, the Germans needed bridges. Every crossing mattered, every delay was fatal. The weather was their ally. Low clouds and snow-grounded Allied aircraft that normally ruled the skies. Communications between American units were chaotic. Many radios had frozen or lost power in the extreme cold. In the first 48 hours, the front lines buckled. Entire platoons disappeared into the snow. Small groups of American soldiers were scattered, isolated, surrounded. One of those groups was the 1st Platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment, attached to the 99th Infantry Division, a division so new to combat that its men still called themselves green replacements. Under normal conditions, a platoon numbered 40 men. But sickness, frostbite, and casualties had reduced Bouck's unit to 23 effectives. Most were armed with M1 Garans and carbines, a few with Browning machine guns. They carried just enough rations for 2 days, a few crates of ammunition, and radio batteries already fading in the cold. Their mission had been simple: secure the small bridge at Trois Ponts, and report German movement. No one expected an entire Panzer division to come rolling down the valley. While Bouck's men dug foxholes, miles away General Sepp Dietrich, commander of the 6th Panzer Army, studied his maps under the yellow glow of a field lantern. His orders were brutal and precise. Take the bridges at Stavelot and Trois Ponts intact. Cut the American retreat. Move fast or fail. Behind him, his staff whispered doubts. The terrain was narrow, the snow deep, fuel scarce. But Dietrich waved them off. They will never expect us here, he said. They think we have nothing left. He was right. That same night, in a farmhouse near the bridge, Lieutenant Bouck wrote his situation report. No significant enemy activity. Visibility poor. Men in fair condition. He didn't know that 20 miles east, the 1st SS Panzer Division, Lippstadt at Adolf Hitler, Germany, elite armored corps, had already crossed into Belgium and was heading straight for him. By December 19th, word began to filter in from scattered patrols. The Germans were advancing in massive force. Yet the orders for Bouck's platoon didn't change. Hold your position. Deny enemy crossing. He gathered his men that evening inside a frozen barn. The air smelled of diesel and hay. He spread a map across a crate, tracing the thin blue line of the Amblève River. This bridge, he said, tapping it with his pencil, is the only direct route for armor heading west. If they get across, they've reached the highway to Liege. If they don't, he paused, letting the silence fill the room. Then every minute we hold them here buys someone else a chance to fight. They nodded quietly, solemnly, no speeches. Just a shared understanding that tomorrow might be their last day. Outside, snow kept falling, muting the world. In the distance, the dull rumble of artillery echoed like thunder rolling behind mountains. Each man went about his tasks in silence, stringing barbed wire, checking firing lanes, cleaning frozen bolts. Private Sam Jenkins adjusted his helmet and whispered to his friend, 23 of us. Against what? A few scouts, maybe. His buddy smirked. Sure, maybe a couple of them lost their way. Neither could know that the enemy they joked about outnumbered them 35-1. That night, American command posts across the Ardennes erupted in confusion. Reports of German paratroopers dropping behind lines turned out to be false. But fuel depots were already burning. Bridges were being blown to slow the advance. Troops were retreating west in chaos. And in the middle of that chaos, one tiny platoon stayed put. At 5 o'clock on December 20th, Bouck received his last transmission before the radio went silent. Hold the bridge as long as possible. Reinforcements en route. No one ever said when they'd arrive. He folded the message, slipped it into his pocket, and looked at his men. 23 faces half hidden by scarves and fear. Then he said, "Looks like we're the line, gentlemen. Let's make it count." None of them knew that the storm roaring toward them was not a patrol, not even a battalion, but an entire German regiment supported by tanks and armored cars. In the snow-dim light, Bouck tightened his gloves and took one last look at the bridge. Black steel gleaming under a thin sheet of ice. Somewhere beyond that fog waited hundreds of men, who had no idea that a handful of Americans were about to change the timetable of Hitler's last offensive. The world's largest land battle on the Western Front was underway. And at its heart, at one forgotten river crossing in Belgium, 23 men were about to stand against it. The night before the storm, Trois Ponts seemed almost peaceful, the kind of silence that makes you question if war is truly real. Snow blanketed the roofs, muffling the world in white. Beneath the stillness, the Amblève River murmured softly, its surface crusted with ice, flowing beneath the steel trusses of the bridge that 23 men had sworn to defend. Lieutenant Lyle Bouck walked the line one last time before dawn. His boots crunched over frost, his breath forming clouds that drifted away into the darkness. He checked every post, every foxhole, speaking in low tones, so as not to carry. His men had fortified the bridge, as best they could, with what little they had. Sandbags stacked waist-high, barbed wire strung across the roadside, trip flares buried under snow, and the bridge girders lined with C3 explosives ready to detonate if the enemy tried to cross. The setup wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was in war. But it was enough to make the place feel defensible, if you ignored the odds. He crouched beside Corporal William Kuntz, who was hunched over the .30 caliber Browning. Kuntz's hands were bare despite the bitter cold, his knuckles red and raw as he adjusted the feed belt. "You good on ammo?" Bouck asked. Kuntz nodded. "About 2,000 rounds for this one, sir. Maybe a little less if we count the ones I just dropped in the snow." Bouck smiled faintly. "Then don't miss." Kuntz smirked back. "I'll try to make every bullet count." A few yards away, Private Jenkins and Private Simmons were stringing more wire along the road, their laughter muffled by scarves. Jenkins pulled a bent nail from his pocket and carved something into the butt of his rifle. The words 36 hours. When Simmons asked what it meant, Jenkins just shrugged. "I guess," he said, "feels about right." Inside a nearby farmhouse that served as their command post, a lantern flickered weakly. The air smelled of damp straw and gun oil. Sergeant Eddie Shapiro, the radio operator, tapped the transmitter again, trying to raise HQ. Only static replied. He sighed, rubbed his temples, and muttered, "It's like screaming into a snowstorm." Bouck glanced at the map spread across the table, a tattered piece of paper showing the river, the bridge, and a few scattered villages. The nearest friendly unit was several miles west. Between them and help lay a web of frozen roads crawling with enemy scouts. The thought made him uneasy, but he said nothing. His job wasn't to show fear. His job was to buy time. He stepped outside again. The wind had picked up, carrying with it a faint metallic hum. Somewhere far away, an engine turned over, then another. The sound drifted across the valley, distant yet unmistakable. Bouck froze. That was no supply truck. It was too rhythmic, too heavy. Tank engines. Multiple. He lifted his binoculars, but the fog was thick, a white curtain that swallowed everything beyond 100 yards. All he saw were snowflakes dancing in the beam of his flashlight. Still, his gut told him the truth. The enemy was moving. At 5:50 hours, Bouck gathered his men inside the farmhouse. The lantern flickered, throwing shadows across tired faces. "Listen up," he said. "We've got movement east of the river. Tanks, maybe infantry. Could be a recon unit. Could be the main push. Either way, this bridge is their way forward. We hold here until command tells us otherwise." One of the men, a mechanic named PVT, Alan Ricks, frowned. "Sir, what if command never calls?" Bouck hesitated. Then he answered simply, "Then we hold anyway." The men nodded. There were no cheers, no bravado, just quiet acceptance. They knew the math. 23 against God knew how many. But war isn't about math. It's about moments, decisions made in the cold, when no one is watching. As they dispersed to their positions, the fog thickened, swallowing the bridge in a grey shroud. The only light came from the dim glow of a few burning cigarettes. The last taste of normalcy before hell arrived. Bouck climbed into his foxhole at the near end of the bridge. From here, he could see the faint outline of the steel trusses stretching into nothingness. He adjusted his field glasses again, though there was little to see. The wind carried a strange calm, the kind that presses on your chest and tells you something terrible is coming. He thought of home, of his wife waiting in Missouri, of the letter he hadn't emailed yet, because the supply trucks hadn't come through in days. He reached into his pocket and felt the folded paper anyway. A letter that began with, "Don't worry, I'm somewhere quiet." A faint chuckle escaped him. Somewhere quiet. Not for long. At 6:20 hours, Sergeant Shapiro's radio crackled for the first time in hours. A distant voice came through, garbled, fragmented, almost lost in static. Enemy armor. Pushing west. Hold all bridges. Delay at all costs. Then nothing. Bouck exhaled slowly. He checked his watch. 6:30. The snow was falling harder now. Somewhere beyond that curtain of white engines, growled like thunder behind a mountain. He whispered to himself, "All right, let's see what you've got." The stillness stretched on for another 10 minutes. Then, faintly, a new sound, boots crunching snow, the creak of metal tracks, the metallic clink of rifles being loaded. The men could hear it now too. No one spoke. They just gripped their weapons tighter. Private Jenkins leaned toward his foxhole partner and murmured, "Feels like the whole damn forest is walking toward us." His partner nodded. "Then let's make it trip." Bouck raised his hand in a silent signal. Machine gun swiveled. Fingers tightened around triggers. The air felt electric, every heartbeat too loud. And then, through the fog, the first dark silhouettes appeared. German infantry in white camouflage. Moving cautiously across the snow. Bouck took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Wait for it," he whispered. The Germans stepped closer, unaware of what waited ahead. 23 Americans held their breath, their fingers poised. The calm was about to shatter. 6:45 hours. The valley awoke in thunder. The first German platoon emerged from the mist, white-clad figures moving cautiously along the snow-packed road, their breath forming pale clouds. They advanced in silence, rifles at the ready, confident that the crossing ahead was barely defended. The morning fog, dense and merciless, hid the truth. 23 American soldiers lay in wait, invisible in their foxholes and behind sandbag walls. Lieutenant Lyle Bouck raised his hand, palm open, waiting. His men had orders not to fire until the enemy was within 75 yards, close enough for the Brownings and Garons to be deadly, far enough that they couldn't throw grenades onto the bridge. The first German soldier stepped onto the icy steel grating. His boots clanged, echoing faintly. Another followed. Then a half-track rumbled behind them, its engine coughing black smoke into the frozen air. Bouck could feel the vibration through the ground. He glanced down at his watch. 6:48. Then he whispered, "Now." The world exploded. The .30 Ocal Brownings opened up, roaring in unison, spitting 450 rounds per minute each. The 50 cal machine gun at the bridgehead added its booming rhythm, a sound so deep it seemed to shake the air itself. Muzzle flashes tore the fog apart in bursts of orange light. The first burst ripped through the German front line, dropping men before they could even react. Snow erupted where bullets struck. Metal screamed. The half-track jerked sideways as its driver slumped over, and the vehicle crashed into the bridge railing, smoke and steam billowing from its pierced radiator. Private Sam Jenkins, manning the 50 cal, squeezed the trigger until his gloves smoked from friction. The belt fed through his hands, shell casings flying like golden rain. He shouted over the gunfire, "They're running! They're running!" But they weren't running yet. On the far side, the Germans dove for cover behind wreckage and snowbanks, firing back blindly. Their rounds hissed overhead, punching holes in the sandbags, splintering the wooden railing. One bullet struck near Bouck's head, showering him with splinters. He wiped his cheek and kept calling corrections. Shorter bursts. Aim low. Don't waste it. Within 10 minutes, the ground in front of the bridge was a tangle of smoke, blood, and twisted metal. The first wave had been annihilated. For a moment, the only sound was the ringing in their ears and the faint groan of the half-track S-engine dying. The men glanced at each other, wide-eyed, half laughing in disbelief. Then the second wave came. Dozens of Germans burst from the fog, shouting, throwing grenades. Mortar shells began to whistle overhead. The first dropped short, the second too long. The third landed square in the middle of the road and exploded in a shower of white snow and black dirt. The shockwave flattened Bouck's cap. He ducked instinctively, yelling for Jenkins to shift fire. On the left, they're trying to flank. Private Alan Ricks fired his M1 until the barrel steamed. Each shot cracked in the cold, echoing like hammer blows. He shouted over the din, "They keep coming, Lieutenant. Where the hell's the rest of our army?" Bouck didn't answer. He couldn't. The radio was gone. A mortar fragment had punched through the set minutes earlier, silencing their only link to command. They were on their own. The fight turned desperate. The Germans had brought up armored cars, their machine guns sweeping across the bridge. The Americans ducked low, firing in bursts. The Brownings rattled, smoking from the heat. The 50 cal barrel, glowing faint red, hissed as Jenkins poured snow over it to cool it down. Behind him, Corporal Coons reloaded belts with shaking fingers. "We're down to our last crate," he yelled. Bouck leaned over the parapet, firing his carbine at a shadow moving near the bridge. The man dropped, vanishing into the snow. Bouck ducked back, breathing hard, his heart pounding so loud he could barely hear the gunfire anymore. By 9 o'clock hours, 3 attacks had been repelled. Smoke drifted in layers across the frozen river. The sun, a pale disk behind clouds, barely illuminated the carnage. The road to the bridge was littered with bodies, and the smoking remains of 2 German half-tracks. Still, the Germans didn't retreat. From the forest, a deeper growl began, the unmistakable sound of tank engines revving. Bouck looked at the distant tree line and muttered, "They're bringing in armor." He crawled back to the command post, where Sergeant Shapiro was crouched over the shattered radio, futilely tapping the keys. "Can't reach anyone," Shapiro said. "The line's dead." Bouck nodded grimly. "Then we hold until we can't." At 9:30, another shell burst behind them, collapsing part of the sandbag wall. Private Simmons screamed as shrapnel sliced his leg. The medic patched him with morphine and a tourniquet, whispering, "You're not dying here, buddy. Not today." The Germans were learning. They shifted tactics. One squad feigned a frontal assault, while another tried to cross the river downstream, using the frozen shallows. Bouck spotted them through the fog and ordered his remaining riflemen to fire. The ice cracked under German boots, dropping several into the freezing current. Their cries were muffled by the roar of gunfire. By 11 o'clock, the first assault was over. The enemy pulled back, dragging their wounded through the snow. Bouck slumped against the sandbags, his hands trembling, smoke rising from the machine gun barrels beside him. They had survived the first wave. Barely he looked over the bridge, at least 40 enemy bodies lay scattered. Maybe more hidden in the fog. 2 of his men were dead, 5 wounded. Ammunition was running low. Food and water were almost gone. Yet none of them spoke of retreat. Bouck stared at the distant tree line, where the fog thickened again. Somewhere out there, German officers were regrouping, furious that a handful of Americans had held them for 4 hours. He turned to his men, his voice hoarse but steady. "They'll be back. And next time, they'll come angry." Private Jenkins reloaded the .50 cal, slapping the belt into place. He grinned weakly. "Then we'll just make him angrier, sir." Bouck smiled despite himself. The snow fell harder, blotting out the sun, covering the wreckage as if the earth itself wanted to forget. But the bridge still stood. And as long as it did, so would they. By noon on December 20th, the men of Lieutenant Bouck's platoon had been fighting for nearly 6 hours. Their uniforms were shredded, their weapons scorched from overuse, and the air around the bridge was thick with gunpowder and steam. The fog had mixed with smoke, forming a gray curtain that stung the eyes and burned the lungs. But the bridge still held. Bouck crouched behind a sandbag wall, wiping soot from his face. His gloves were stiff with frozen blood. Not all of it. The radio lay in pieces beside him, its wires hanging loose, its metal casing blackened by shrapnel. Sergeant Shapiro, his radio operator, sat silently next to it, staring into the snow. He had stopped trying to fix it hours ago. There was no signal left to reach. "Sir," said Corporal Coons, kneeling beside Bouck, "ammo's down to maybe 500 rounds for the Brownings, 2 belts for the 50. The Garand guys have what's in their clips. That's it." Bouck's jaw clenched. "What about grenades?" 6 left. After that, we're throwing rocks. Bouck gave a grim smile. Then make everyone count. He knew what was coming next. The Germans would bring more men, maybe tanks. They wouldn't make the same mistake twice. And when they realized how few defenders there really were, it would all be over. Unless Somehow, he could make them believe otherwise. He crawled to the edge of the bridge, where a tangle of wires led to the C3 explosives the engineers had planted 2 days before. Each charge was about the size of a brick, stacked under the steel trusses, enough to send the entire span collapsing into the Amblève River if detonated correctly. Bouck checked the detonator box. Still functional, though one wire had been severed by shrapnel. He reconnected it with a pocket knife and a twist of frozen copper. Private Ricks approached, clutching a carbine. "Sir, if we blow it now, we end this, right? They can't cross." Bouck shook his head. "We blow it, they build a pontoon bridge, and roll right past us. Our job isn't to stop them forever. It's to stop them long enough." "How long's that supposed to be?" Bouck gave a weary grin. "Long enough for someone else to notice we're dying here." A nearby explosion rocked the ground, sending snow and splinters flying. The Germans were probing, again. Small arms fire, testing for weakness. A bullet tore through the sandbags above Bouck's head, showering him with dirt. He ducked instinctively, then yelled to the nearest foxhole, "Shift fire right. They're trying the riverbank again." The next minutes were chaos. German infantry crept down the frozen river, using fog and wreckage as cover. Bouck ordered Private Jenkins to switch the 50 cal toward the right flank. Jenkins fired a short burst. The recoil slammed his shoulder, the tracers cutting through fog like fiery threads. The sound echoed down the valley, a mechanical heartbeat of defiance. The Germans retreated again, leaving dark stains on the snow. It wasn't victory, just survival. And survival was starting to feel temporary. Inside the farmhouse that served as their command post, Bouck called his non-commissioned officers together. Shapiro, Kuntz, Jenkins, and Ricks huddled around the table. The single oil lamp flickered weakly between them. Bouck laid out the plan. "We'll wire the rest of the bridge with whatever explosives we've got left. If armor rolls in, we drop it. Until then, keep firing, like we've got a whole company up here. I want them to believe that." Shapiro frowned. "Sir, they'll figure it out eventually." Bouck nodded. "Then let's make eventually mean tomorrow." Outside, the wind howled through broken windows, scattering loose papers. From somewhere in the distance came the faint sound of German shouting. Commands, coordination. Bouck couldn't make out the words, but he didn't need to. They were regrouping. He looked around the room, faces pale with exhaustion, uniforms soaked in sweat and snow. Yet in every pair of eyes he saw the same spark. Not fear, not even courage. Something quieter, sharper. The stubborn refusal to surrender. "Men," he said softly, "this bridge isn't just steel. It's a clock. Every minute we hold it, the rest of the army gets closer to fighting again. That's all we're doing, buying time. Nothing fancy, just time." Kuntz gave a tired chuckle. "Then let's charge interest while we're at it." They laughed. Thin, brittle laughter that cut through the gloom for a moment. Then, just as suddenly, the laughter died. A shell exploded nearby, shaking the building. The lamp shattered, plunging the room into darkness. Bouck's ears rang. "Positions," he shouted. "Back to your holes." The men scattered, sliding through snow to their posts. By mid-afternoon, the Germans tried again. This time they came from both sides. Infantry advancing across the road, another unit crawling along the riverbank. The Americans answered with everything they had left. Kuhn's machine gun chattered, until its barrel smoked white. Jenkins fired the 50 cal in bursts, tracing each line of fire like a painter slashing brushstrokes across the canvas of war. Through his binoculars, Bouck saw the German commander, a tall officer in a greatcoat, standing behind the line, shouting through a megaphone. Even at this distance, Bouck could feel the man's frustration. He'd expected a handful of engineers. Instead, he'd run into what looked and sounded like a full-blown defensive company. He wasn't the only one fooled. Captured years later, a German soldier from that day recalled, "We believed we were facing at least 200 Americans. Machine guns on both banks, mortar, even artillery. We did not know it was only 23 men. The illusion was working. But illusions don't last forever." As the sun dipped behind the ridge, the snow turned blue and the cold deepened. Bouck's men huddled in silence between bursts of fire. Their hands trembled from exhaustion and frostbite. One man's fingers were too numb to reload. Another had started coughing blood from concussion shock. Bouck moved between foxholes, whispering encouragement, sharing the last of their chocolate rations. He looked down the road. No reinforcements. No headlights. No sound of engines except the ones belonging to their enemies. The Germans would be back at dawn. He knew it. And next time, they'd bring everything. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the folded letter again, the one to his wife. The paper was smudged and torn, but the words were still legible. "We're somewhere quiet." He smiled faintly. "Quiet," he murmured to himself. "Sure." Then he stuffed the letter back into his pocket and looked out toward the frozen river, where the faint glow of enemy campfires flickered through the fog. They were waiting for morning. So were he and his 22 men. The night fell early that December, swallowing the forest in a cold so deep it made breath feel like smoke from a dying fire. By 18 o'clock hours, the temperature had dropped below 20 degrees Celsius, 4 degrees Fahrenheit. The snow no longer fell in flakes, but in tiny crystals that hissed against metal. The bridge, littered with shell fragments and blood, gleamed faintly under the moonlight, a monument of ice and ruin. For the 23 Americans at Trois Ponts, the world had shrunk to the length of that bridge and the few dozen yards of frozen ground around it. Beyond that was darkness, and an army waiting. Lieutenant Lyle Bouck crouched beside the 50 cal, staring into the fog that clung to the river. The gun's barrel steamed softly, the smell of burnt powder still heavy in the air. He could hear faint movements in the forest beyond the river. Metal scraping, whispered German voices, an occasional cough quickly stifled. They were out there, regrouping, planning their next strike. "Any sign of them?" whispered Private Jenkins, his breath fogging the air. Bouck shook his head. "Not yet. They're cold too. But they'll come when they think we're sleeping." He looked down the line. The men were ghosts now, faces gray with fatigue, eyes sunken, every movement mechanical. Their gloves were torn. Their fingers bled from frostbite and reloading in the freezing dark. A few still clutched rifles even while they slept in shifts, unwilling to let go. Inside the farmhouse command post, the air reeked of smoke and damp wool. A small candle burned on a crate, throwing long shadows across the walls. Sergeant Shapiro was hunched over the ruined radio, tapping the transmitter like a priest trying to wake a god. "Anything?" Bouck asked quietly. "Nothing but static," Shapiro said. "It's like the world forgot we exist." Bouck gave a grim smile. "Then we reminded in the morning." Outside, the night pressed closer. At 20 o'clock hours, German mortar began probing again, single rounds at wide intervals, like wolves testing a fence. Each impact shook loose snow from the trees and rattled the roof tiles. The Americans didn't return fire. Bouck had ordered silence unless they saw movement on the bridge. Ammunition was life now. Every bullet had to count. The men listened instead to the wind howling through the pines, to the soft crack of ice on the river, to their own heartbeats drumming in the dark. "Sir," whispered Corporal Kuntz, "you think they'll hit again tonight?" Bouck's reply was low and steady. "If I were them, I'd wait till dawn. But they might test us before that." Kuntz nodded, clutching his rifle tighter. "I'll be awake either way." Around 22 o'clock hours, movement flickered across the far bank, faint lanterns bobbing in the fog. A German patrol, 4 men, maybe 5, moving along the ice. Bouck signaled for silence. The Americans watched as the shapes crept forward, testing the frozen surface with their bayonets. When the first man reached mid-river, Bouck raised his hand. Jenkins sighted the 50 cal. One burst, just one, split the night like thunder. The tracer rounds carved a line of fire across the fog. The lead German collapsed. The rest scrambled backward, their shouts echoing off the water. Then silence again. The echoes lingered longer than the fight itself. For the next few hours, the Germans probed from different angles, sending small teams to test the flanks. Each time they were met with short, brutal bursts of fire. Eventually, they stopped trying. The valley grew quiet again, unnaturally quiet, as if even the snow held its breath. At 2 o'clock hours, Bouck made his rounds. He moved from foxhole to foxhole, checking on his men. One soldier, Private Ricks, was shaking uncontrollably, not from fear but from the cold. His face was pale, his lips blue. Bouck knelt beside him and pulled a blanket over his shoulders. "Hang in there, kid," he said softly. Ricks managed a weak grin. "Just warming up for the next round." Sir Bouck squeezed his shoulder and moved on. He paused near the bridge, staring at the snow-covered bodies still lying where they'd fallen earlier. The moonlight made them look peaceful, like figures carved from stone. War had no dignity, he thought, only endurance. He returned to the farmhouse, where Shapiro had finally given up on the radio. The sergeant sat against the wall, cleaning his rifle by candlelight. "Still no word?" Bouck asked. Shapiro shook his head. "Nothing. But I think they know. Wherever they are, someone's got to notice all the noise we made today." Bouck smiled faintly. "Let's hope they're listening." Around 4 o'clock, the temperature dropped again. The candle flickered, almost out. Outside, the fog thickened, turning the valley into a featureless white void. The only light came from tracer rounds still glowing faintly in the snow like dying embers. Bouck stepped outside one last time before dawn. The cold hit him like a wall. He looked toward the east, where a faint line of gray hinted at the coming sunrise. Somewhere out there, the Germans were preparing. He could feel it. That electric tension in the air before an explosion. He thought of his men, scattered in the snow, waiting for whatever came next. He thought of the bridges behind them, the convoys that might already be moving because of the hours they'd bought. And he thought of how close dawn was now, just an hour or two away. He whispered into the wind, "Hold till daylight. Just hold till daylight." Then he ducked back into his foxhole, pulled his collar tight, and waited for the sound he knew would come. The rising growl of engines rolling toward the bridge once more. And when it came, just before the first light of morning, it was not the small arms chatter of infantry, but the deep, rhythmic roar of tanks. The night of ghosts was over. The morning of fire was about to begin. At 6:30 hours, the fog began to thin, revealing the pale light of another freezing dawn. And with it, the unmistakable growl of German armor moving through the valley. The men of Lieutenant Bouck's platoon stirred in their foxholes, numb fingers clutching weapons that felt heavier than they had the day before. Then they heard it, the deep, rhythmic rumble that made the earth itself tremble. Panzer IVs, maybe two, maybe more. The sound rolled down the road, like thunder rolling over stone. Bouck lifted his binoculars. Through the fog he saw the silhouettes of tanks emerging, black shapes crowned with white crosses, flanked by dozens of infantry in snow camouflage. Behind them came half-tracks, mounted machine guns already scanning the tree line. "Jesus," muttered Corporal Coons, his voice low. "They brought the whole damn army." Bouck didn't look away. "Then we make them earn every yard." He crawled to the detonator box wired to the bridge charges. The copper wires shimmered faintly with frost. The C3 explosives were still buried beneath the bridge's central girders, enough to blow the span clean into the river. But once he triggered it, there'd be no way back. He glanced toward the sky, half hoping for the whine of Allied aircraft. But there was only silence. The weather was still their enemy. The first shell landed 20 yards short of the American line, sending snow and shards of ice spraying into the air. The blast flattened a section of sandbags and knocked two men backward. Bouck shouted for them to get down as another shell screamed overhead and exploded behind the farmhouse. The tanks were firing blind through the fog, but they didn't need precision, just pressure. Each impact shook the bridge, the shock waves rolling through the frozen ground like distant earthquakes. Private Jenkins, still manning the 50 cal, braced himself behind the gun. "Sir," he yelled, "what the hell are we supposed to do against tanks?" Bouck shouted back, "Aim for the infantry. The tanks can't climb the bridge if their men can't lead them." Jenkins gritted his teeth and opened fire. The heavy gun boomed, each burst tearing through the fog and punching into the advancing German troops. The 50 cal slugs hit with terrifying force, capable of piercing steel at 200 yards. Men fell. The line staggered. But the tanks kept coming. The first Panzer rolled to within 150 yards. Its turret turned slowly, the barrel leveling toward the American line. Bouck saw it through his binoculars. The muzzle flash was blinding. The shell hit the bridge approach, blowing a crater the size of a car. Snow, dirt, and blood filled the air. When the smoke cleared, Bouck saw that Kuhn's position was gone. His machine gun shattered, the man himself nowhere to be seen. Rage filled him, cold and sharp. "Hold the line," he shouted. "Don't give them the bridge." The tanks advanced again, crawling like monsters through the smoke. German infantry moved alongside them, shouting and firing. The air was filled with the staccato rhythm of MG-42s, their high-pitched chatter slicing through the deeper roar of the Brownings. Bouck crawled to the detonator, checking it again. The wires held. The charges were live. But he waited. Blowing the bridge too early would waste their only chance to trap the enemy on it. He needed them closer. Another explosion tore through the farmhouse, setting the roof on fire. Flames rose against the gray sky, casting a sickly glow over the battlefield. The heat made the snow hiss and melt, turning the ground into a muddy slush streaked with red. Bouck shouted over the chaos. "Fall back to secondary positions. Keep firing and draw them onto the bridge." The men obeyed, dragging wounded comrades with them. Shapiro limped toward the riverbank, firing his rifle with one hand. Jenkins stayed on the 50 cal, covering their retreat. Through the fog, Bouck saw the lead Panzer reach the bridgehead. Its treads groaned as it began to roll across the steel deck. The second tank followed behind, its engine roaring. Bouck took a deep breath, then slammed the detonator switch. The explosion split the morning open. For a fraction of a second, there was silence, the kind that comes before thunder. Then the bridge erupted in a pillar of fire and smoke. Steel girders twisted and tore apart like paper. The lead Panzer vanished in a cloud of dust and flame, the blast flinging debris hundreds of feet into the air. The second tank tried to reverse, but the ground gave way beneath it, dragging it into the collapsing wreckage. The sound rolled across the valley, echoing for miles, a thunderclap of defiance. When the smoke cleared, nothing remained of the center span but jagged steel and fire flickering on the icy water below. The Germans on the far side stood in shock, staring at the void where the bridge had been. Bouck looked over the ruins, chest heaving, ears ringing. His men were alive, at least most of them. The blast had cut off the enemy's advance. For now, but the cost was heavy. Kunz was gone. 2 others lay wounded, one with shrapnel buried in his shoulder, another burned from the explosion. The farmhouse was a ruin, half collapsed and still smoldering. Bouck stumbled through the smoke, calling out names. Jenkins. Shapiro. Here, sir, Jenkins answered from the riverbank, his face black with soot. I think we did it. Bouck nodded, panting. Yeah, for now. He looked out over the destroyed bridge, the wreckage glowing red in the dawn. The river hissed, where molten steel met ice. On the far side, German medics dragged bodies from the snow, while officers barked orders, pointing toward the forest, already planning another way around. Bouck knew it was only a matter of time before they found one. But they had done what they came to do. He turned to his remaining men. That's it, he said quietly. We've done all we can. Fall back to cover and tend the wounded. As they obeyed, he sank to his knees in the snow, exhaustion finally breaking through the adrenaline. He looked at the rising smoke curling above the trees, and whispered to no one in particular. 36 hours. That's all it took to change everything. Behind him, the ruins of the bridge still burned, a pyre for the dead, and a beacon for the living. The Germans would cross somewhere else, but not here. Not today. When the smoke finally thinned, the fight was over. The bridge was gone. The river boiled with twisted steel, and the little patch of earth the Americans had defended was now just blackened snow and silence. For a few heartbeats, Lieutenant Bouck believed it was finished, that the Germans would turn back, regroup, and bypass the ruin. But the echo of the explosion had done more than destroy a crossing. It had announced to every enemy soldier in the valley exactly where those 23 men were. By 10 o'clock hours, the fog returned, curling low over the water. Out of it came the sound of boots, hundreds of them, and shouted commands in clipped German. Bouck, crouched behind the remnants of a wall, realized they were being surrounded. He gave the only order left to give. No more shooting unless you can see your target. Save what you've got. The men obeyed. They had maybe 50 rounds between them, 3 working rifles, and 1 wounded who couldn't move. The cold had settled into their bones. Even pulling a trigger hurt. The first Germans appeared from the woods on both flanks, firing short bursts to pin them down. Bouck's platoon answered with what little remained. A burst here, a single shot there, each one deliberate, buying a few more seconds. Then a grenade landed in the snow just behind the American line and blew apart the last machine gun nest. Bouck felt a searing pain in his shoulder, a rifle round that spun him around and dropped him into the snow. His vision blurred. The world narrowed to the sound of shouting voices and the taste of blood in his mouth. When he awoke a few minutes later, Sergeant Shapiro was kneeling beside him, holding a white cloth on a stick. Sir, we can't hold any longer, Shapiro said. They're all around us. Bouck managed a nod. All right. Tell the men to cease fire. The shooting stopped. A strange quiet settled over the battlefield. Through the smoke, German soldiers advanced cautiously, weapons raised. One officer shouted for the Americans to step out with their hands up. One by one, they did. Some limped. Some carried the wounded. All looked half frozen, faces blackened with soot, eyes hollow from 2 days without rest. A German captain approached, pistol in hand. He studied Bouck for a long moment, then lowered his weapon. You are the commander? He asked, in accented English. Bouck nodded weakly. The captain looked over the wreckage of the bridge, and the dozens of German dead scattered around it. Then, almost respectfully, he said, You fought like a company. We thought there were 200 of you. The words struck Bouck harder than the bullet had. He gave a faint, weary smile. There were 23, he said. The Germans searched them, collected their weapons, and began marching them east, along the snow-covered road. Behind them, the ruins of the bridge still smoked. The smell of cordite hung heavy in the air. As they trudged away, Private Jenkins looked back once more. "Guess we held it, huh?" he murmured. Bouck, pale and bleeding, managed to reply, "Long enough." They were taken first to a temporary holding site near Stavlet, then moved by truck towards Stalag 12A, a prisoner of war camp in Germany. The journey was a blur of pain and exhaustion. They were given no food for 2 days, only melted snow to drink. Yet even as prisoners, the men of Bouck's platoon refused to spare. At night, they whispered among themselves, recounting the fight. Measuring the impossible numbers, -23 men against 800. 8 rifles against hundreds. 1 bridge that held for 36 hours. The math didn't make sense. But the result did. The delay they'd caused had forced the German armored columns to reroute, costing them precious time and fuel. That delay allowed the 82nd Airborne Division to move in and secure the next bridge west. In a war decided by hours, those hours meant everything. Bouck's shoulder wound festered but didn't kill him. A German medic cleaned it roughly, muttering something that sounded like "tough bastard." Shapiro and Jenkins stayed close, sharing scraps of bread whenever they could steal them. In captivity, the platoon became legend among the other POEs, the tiny unit that had stopped an army. Months later, as the Allies pushed into Germany, Stalag 12A was liberated. Bouck and the survivors emerged gaunt, filthy, and alive. None of them had forgotten the bridge, the cold, or the faces of those who hadn't made it. When reporters asked Bouck what had kept them fighting, he answered simply, "Orders were to hold the bridge. We did." When the war finally ended, the surviving members of Lieutenant Lyle Bouck's platoon returned to a country that was already celebrating victory. Parades, flags and brass bands filling streets that none of them felt ready to walk. They had survived capture, frostbite, starvation, and the constant shadow of death. But when they tried to tell their story, few listened. The headlines were about Patton's tanks and the liberation of Paris. Not a platoon of 23 unknown soldiers who'd held a single bridge somewhere in Belgium. For years, their stand at Trois Ponts lived only in their memories, a ghost of a battle that official reports barely mentioned. The paperwork called it a minor delaying action. The army had bigger battles to record. Bouck went home to Missouri, carrying the war in his shoulder and in his dreams. Sergeant Shapiro became a teacher. Private Jenkins, the kid who had manned the 50 cal, returned to Texas and drove trucks. Each man built a life, but none of them ever forgot the sound of that bridge collapsing, or the faces of those who didn't come back. For decades, they stayed silent. No one asked, and they didn't volunteer the memory. Veterans of the 99th Division would occasionally meet in trade stories, but even there, their tale felt too small to matter, until one reunion in 1977. When a military historian approached Bouck after hearing fragments of the story, the historian listened, checked the archives, and found almost nothing. No formal commendations, no citations. Just a few lines in an after-action report about stiff resistance near Trois Ponts. But the German records told a different story. An entire battalion delayed for more than a day by intense American fire from an unknown force at the Amblave Bridge. That discovery started a quiet campaign for recognition. Letters were sent to Washington, testimonies gathered from survivors, even interviews with former German officers who confirmed what the Americans had done. One of those German officers, Colonel Joachim Peiper, commander of the 1st SS Panzer Division, gave a striking admission years after the war. Our advance was slowed by stubborn resistance at several points. One of those, near Trois Ponts, delayed my armor for nearly 2 days. We assumed it was a full battalion. It was not. The story reached the Pentagon, then the White House. In 1981, nearly 37 years after the battle, the U.S. Congress finally recognized Bouck's platoon with the Presidential Unit Citation, the highest honor an American military unit can receive for extraordinary heroism in action against an armed enemy. It was the smallest unit in U.S. history ever to receive that distinction. During the ceremony, the surviving men stood side by side again, older, slower, their hair gray, their hands trembling not from fear but from age. The photographs from that day show them smiling, some weeping quietly as the medals were pinned. Behind them, a blown-up map of the Ardennes highlighted the small dot labeled Trois Ponts. Bouck, now in his late 50s, spoke last. His voice was calm, measured, but carried the weight of everything he'd lived through. "We didn't think we were doing anything special," he said. "We were just told to hold the bridge. That's what soldiers do. We hold, even when no one's watching." The audience stood in silence, then erupted in applause. That day, the forgotten battle at Trois Ponts was no longer forgotten. Newspapers across the country printed the story under headlines like, "Platoon of 23 finally honored for a heroic stand." The official citation read, "Displaying unparalleled courage and determination. The platoon delayed superior enemy forces, inflicted heavy casualties, and enabled friendly units to regroup and counterattack. Their valor changed the course of the enemy advance during the Battle of the Bulge." But for Bouck, recognition wasn't about medals. It was about memory. That those hours on the frozen bridge, those names carved into helmets and letters never sent, would not vanish into history's silence. After the ceremony, one reporter asked him what he thought about the word hero. Bouck shook his head. "Heroes? No. Heroes are the ones who didn't make it off that bridge." The next year, a small granite monument was erected near the site of the battle. It stands just a few feet from where the bridge once crossed the Amblave. The inscription is simple: "In memory of the 1st Platoon, 394th Infantry Regiment, 99th Infantry Division." 23 men, who held when holding seemed impossible. Tourists rarely find it. It's off the main road, hidden behind pine trees, but every December, a few aging veterans and their families gather there, lighting candles in the snow. They talk quietly about those 36 hours that changed the rhythm of a war. About the sound of Brownings echoing across the valley. About frostbite and fear, and the strange pride that comes with knowing you didn't run. History had finally remembered them. But for the men of the 394th, it had never forgotten itself. Today, the bridge at Trois Ponts is gone. In its place, a newer span crosses the same river, silent and unremarkable. Cars pass over it every day. Locals heading to market. Tourists chasing autumn colors, unaware that beneath those waters lie the twisted remnants of the bridge that once held back an army. Yet, if you stand there at dawn when the fog curls low and the air carries that sharp winter stillness, you can almost hear it. The faint echo of machine guns, the roar of engines, the shouts of 23 young men who refused to give ground. That is their legacy. The battle at Trois Ponts was never about territory. It was about time, the rarest currency in war. 36 hours may sound like nothing measured against the scale of World War II. But those hours changed the shape of the Ardennes campaign. While Bouck's platoon was fighting, bleeding, and finally captured, the 82nd Airborne Division and 30th Infantry Division were racing to set up defensive lines further west. The German delay at that bridge meant the difference between a breakthrough and a stalemate. Historians later calculated that had the Germans crossed there as planned, they could have reached the Meuse River at least a full day earlier, enough to capture fuel depots and threaten Liege instead. They lost momentum, their tanks starved for fuel, and the offensive stalled. From that delay, the Allies found their footing. All because 23 soldiers refused to retreat. Their story is a reminder of what courage often looks like. Not loud, not glorious, but grim and enduring. No sweeping speeches, no cinematic music. Just men doing their duty, long after logic said it was impossible. In military academies today, the stand at Trois Ponts is studied not as a grand victory, but as a lesson in micro-leadership. How clear purpose, discipline, and deception can multiply the power of the few. Bouck's tactical use of terrain, limited ammunition, and psychological misdirection turned a small platoon into what appeared, at least to the enemy, as a full battalion. It's a study in the geometry of defiance. How holding one bridge can hold together an entire front. But beyond tactics, their story lives in something deeper, in the quiet resilience of ordinary men facing the unthinkable. It asks uncomfortable questions. What would you have done? Would you have held that bridge, knowing no reinforcements were coming? Would you have stayed when the tanks appeared, when the radio went silent, when every instinct screamed to run? That question has no easy answer. Maybe that's why their story endures. For the survivors, the legacy wasn't in medals or history books. It was in knowing that when history demanded the impossible, they didn't look away. Bouck once said in an interview late in life, his voice trembling with age, "We weren't trying to be heroes. We were just trying not to fail the men next to us." He died in 2016, at 92, surrounded by family. At his funeral, one of his fellow veterans, one of the last, placed a piece of rusted steel from the old bridge on his casket. On it, scratched by hand, were the words, 23 held, 800 stopped, 36 hours. Today, that bridge, or what's left of it, still rests beneath the Amblave's current. Its iron bones have long rusted away, but the story remains indestructible. Because sometimes the smallest stands cast the longest shadows. Because courage doesn't need numbers, only purpose. And because somewhere, in every generation, there will always be another bridge, another dawn, and another handful of souls who decide that holding the line is worth everything. If you've listened this far, remember this. Every inch of peace we live in was bought by moments like this, by men who stood when standing meant death. So if these stories move you, if they make you wonder what courage really means, subscribe to The Unseen Front. Here, we don't look away from the dark corners of history. We walk straight into them. Because sometimes the smallest voices from the past still have the loudest echoes.